So just something I want to reiterate from the previous recording is that this quota system limited most immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, but allowed for a lot more to be coming from areas like Great Britain and France and Ireland. And this had a lot to do with the Red Scare and people being afraid and paranoid of these immigrants coming over from maybe some potentially dangerous countries. Warren G. Harding is the new president, and he really changes the political scene during the 1920s. Um, During the war, Woodrow Wilson, our president, was a Democratic president, and we switch over to a Republican president. And this is partially because Americans wanted to go back to their old way of life. And this sort of return to normalcy, what Harding used as his campaign promise, really persuaded people to vote for him. This return to normalcy, this meant a return to isolationism, a return to increased economic prosperity and consumer goods. He also ended immigration because people were terrified of the immigrants from the Red Scare, and he stopped trust busting and making reforms. And this was because he favored laissez-faire and big business. It helped that he had a lot of friends in big business, and eventually his administration is pretty tarnished because it's littered with corruption and scandals. And this was due to the fact that he gave government jobs and cabinet jobs to his friends and those people tried to make money in really shady ways. One of the biggest corruption scandals of Harding's administration was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Right around the time that Harding dies in 1923, details are made public that Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Hall, was accepting bribes from private oil companies. Hall allowed companies to control government oil in Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming, in exchange for money and valuable gifts. Hall ends up becoming the first cabinet member to be convicted of crimes while in office. Harding's presidency was essentially ruined when Calvin Coolidge took over after Harding's death. People were relieved, though, because Coolidge had a reputation for being trustworthy and honest. He fired all of Harding's officials that were involved in any sort of scandal, and he restores America's faith in the presidency. So Coolidge is able to win that 1924 election by more than half, which is great. During this time, we also see the first women run for office, especially these two women here, Nellie Taylor Ross and Miriam Ferguson. They actually run for governor, which is a huge step for women since they were only granted the right to vote 4 years prior. So Coolidge's campaign slogan for his administration was "Stay cool with Coolidge." Okay, he takes over after Harding's death, and his economic policies pay off. He was even more committed to big business and trickle-down economics. Um, Trickle-down economics is when the government essentially cuts taxes for the wealthy in the hope that the wealthy will either hire some of the less wealthy to work for them or to buy more goods and have that money trickle down from the very wealthy to the more poverty-stricken American. The economy booms under Coolidge. with the exception of the farmers, of course. Our foreign policy also is changed a little bit. Um, we sign a treaty with Great Britain, Japan, Italy, and France, and we all agree to limit the size of our own navy. And this is the first time that the world powers actually agreed to begin to disarm. In 1928, Coolidge signs the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which actually calls for banning or not using war as a means to resolve any type of conflict or problem. 48 other nations would eventually join in with this pact, but the problem was there really wasn't any other way to enforce peace and enforce this pact amongst these nations. After World War I ends, the U.S. had to switch from the war economy to a consumer economy. This meant that they needed to stop producing weapons and they needed to start producing products like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and the radio. One example of this economic boom was Henry Ford's Model T. Ford was doing better than ever. It only cost $290 for a brand new Model T, as opposed to $850 in 1908. The average person could now afford a car. Ford even let people buy cars on an installment plan. Each month, the person would make a payment until it was paid off. So many cars on the roads led to new businesses. Restaurants, motels, repair shops, gas stations, they all began to pop up, and the government even hires people to build roads and bridges. It also allows people to travel and live in the suburbs or a little bit further away from the cities because they have they have the means to get into their jobs in the cities. They have this new way of traveling. All right, as we already discussed, the Great Migration, it's that migration of African Americans, um, and even we could even add in that immigrants often immigrated over here for the economic opportunities that were afforded to them during this time period. But along with this economic boom, there came this new idea of buying on credit. So people began to buy consumer goods on credit, which means that they were able to buy it now and pay for it later. This is exactly what credit cards do today. So if you don't have the money to buy something, you can use credit and purchase it now, but you will have to pay it back and eventually own it after you pay that off. Um, People were also borrowing money from stockbrokers to invest in the stock market, and that's what that stocks on margin is. So you would put about 10% down and borrow 90% to own stocks. People did this because they believed that they would always have a job to pay it off. So eventually, more Americans are going to be spending way more money than they make. And this is part of the reason why the Great Depression happens, and that's our next unit. But it's important to understand the events and uh, the effects of this economic boom and how it'll later play a part in the downfall of it all. Okay, these are just some pictures from the Roaring Twenties. The social changes that occurred during the Roaring Twenties were the most predominant than any of the others, especially for women. Women were gaining traction in society. They had been working during the war, and now that the men were back, they weren't ready to give up this new sense of being. Many women decided to go to college or to even work. Many became nurses, teachers, librarians, and social workers. When women were granted the right to vote, uh, it gave them this new sense of freedom, and women were no longer conforming to traditional society. They were marrying for love rather than uh, arranged marriages or convenience. They weren't having children as fast or even having as many children, especially with this idea and this concept of birth control that was really appearing. And they were even changing their appearance. These women were known as flappers. Okay, they were carefree, liberated women. They cut their hair really short. Traditionally, women had long hair before this time period. They these new women, these flappers, they wore short skirts, lots of makeup. They smoked, and they were often seen doing dances and at clubs. Before, like I said, traditionally women had long hair, they had very long skirts and with high necklines. So the flapper was the complete opposite of what a traditional woman was thought of. So the Scopes monkey trial, something you need to understand, it was actually a staged trial um, that challenged fundamentalism, which is religion, and evolution, which is this idea of science. And the evolution was more of this modern take on this idea of challenging previous beliefs. So the Scopes monkey trial started it in Tennessee, where it was illegal to teach the theory of evolution to any public funded school. The theory of evolution is the science in which evidence suggests that humans originated from ape-like ancestors. This went against fundamentalist ideas that humans were created by God as per the Bible. John Scopes, he was a biology teacher who was accused of teaching evolution in this stage trial. The trial drew crowds and was heard throughout the country over the radio. In the end, Scopes is found guilty and is fined $100. The Supreme Court overturns the case, but not because they believe Scopes is innocent, but because in Tennessee law, a judge could not issue a fine over $50. The real overall impact or result of this case was just to bring attention to this new modern way of thinking, this challenge to traditional behaviors. All right. Between 1914 and 1926, high school enrollment doubles. Children were attending school instead of working, and this was in part because more women had joined the workplace instead of staying home. People had more time on their hands with new laws that uh, lowered the amount of working hours they had. They had money coming in, so many people were allowed and able to spend time doing nothing or being entertained. Uh, Magazines become popular over this, especially Reader's Digest and Time, two of the most popular magazines that we still have today. And the radio becomes this huge national pastime of this era. So NBC and CBS, I'm sure that rings a bell. They were actually the first radio networks that allowed people all over the country to listen to the same program.